This is the first section of the lecture proper after the admin section I've just finished. This section deals with the stereotype of accountants, and I'm going to be putting up some images and showing some movie clips about the stereotype before discussing what the implications of those stereotypes are for accounting. So we start on slide 8. I'm just looking down because the keyboard of controlling my other computers on my lap. I've got these two images here, one of a woman in a business suit on the left and one of a woman in an evening gown on a catwalk on the right. And I've asked, who's the accountant? Well, I'm fairly devious here, so yes, the woman on the right in the evening gown on the catwalk is the accountant. The woman in the business suit is the model. The reason I put this up was that the normal perception would be the woman in the business suit would be the accountant, because that's a stereotype of an accountant, how an accountant appears. Now, I deliberately chose a woman just to take out the gender bias because of the second image I had on the right. But I could have probably put a man in there, which would be an even stronger reflection of the stereotype, even though the reality of the accounting profession is that men and women make up roughly equal proportions. It tends to be that women are not represented as strongly in the stereotype, nor in the power positions within the accounting profession. But that's the topic for a different lecture. Getting back to the stereotype. The reason I threw these up was that the stereotype is something we perceive without really thinking about. It's something imposed on us by society. And when we see something that is incongruous with the stereotype, we have a reluctance to believe it. So if we saw an accountant dressed as the woman on the right is dressed, we would have trouble believing that she is an accountant, even though that is what her qualifications are. She's also Miss USA from a couple of years ago, which is what she's doing in an evening gown on a catwalk. Now, this stereotype has been around for a long time, and the next slide, slide 9, demonstrate this. This is Il Dottore, a character from 15th century Italian improvisational theatre known as Commedia dell'arte. In this theatre, there's a stock character, well, there's lots of stock characters, but one of the stock characters is Il Dottore. Sometimes it's portrayed as a doctor, sometimes as a lawyer, sometimes as someone involved in finance. But the things that he has in common is that he's always unattractive with his hook-nosed mask, that he's wearing these dull, boring, dark clothes. That he pontificates typically in Latin and serves in the plays to get in the way of the lovers, to prevent the romance that is the subject of the performance. And the reason I put this up is that this is the earliest example we can find of the accounting style stereotype existing in Western culture. It may predate this, but we don't have any evidence of it. Now, this type of stereotype we can see continuing on through things like the plays of Shakespeare, particularly in The Merchant of Venice, where Shakespeare's portrayal of Shylock very much follows Il Dottore's appearance. And we see in The Merchant of Venice Shylock's conundrum, where he's got to make a decision between his money and his family, the famous line, "My ducats, my daughter," where he tries to balance his love of money with the love of family. And how that fits in the stereotype of accountants who would seem to value money. So this stereotype is really, really old. And the importance of this is that it means it's really, really hard to change because it's been there for such a long time. So our stereotype is imposed on us from outside, but we can't change it. We have to live with it or fight against it. And as I'll talk about shortly after looking at a couple of the video clips, is we're better off trying to live with it. The next slide has a video clip in it from a parody of an action movie that some university students in America did about a decade ago, trying to show an action movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger as an accountant using a form of humour called juxtaposition, where you put two incongruous images together to make humour. You want to have a look around, Monty Python does this a lot, and you can have a look at a Monty Python skit called Vocational Guidance Counsel if you want, which will show another portrayal of the accounting stereotype. Now, showing an accountant as an action hero just doesn't make sense with a stereotype. Accountants don't have that image, but it has been done. There's a movie coming out shortly, if it's not already out, called The Accountant, starring Ben Affleck, in which, and the clip of this is on slide 11, in which he plays an accountant with Asperger's who is also a contract assassin. And it uses the accountant in that to make the position that someone with Asperger's would normally receive them as something like an accountant, boring, dull, no social skills. We could also see them as sociopathic. And sort of an interesting portrayal of how the stereotype could be perceived. Moving on to slide 12, which refers to the 2005 movie Hitch, starring Will Smith and Kevin James. Now, I haven't put the video clip up. In the lecture, I played a scene on this from the DVD. I can't post it up to YouTube because it will be copyright, so you'll have to believe me. But in this clip that I start with, it shows Kevin James spilling a cup of coffee all over his newspaper. One of the first images in that is that it's holding a mug, which he then spills all over the newspaper, which has got AICPA, American Institute of CPAs, on it, which identifies him as an accountant. And we then see him being totally socially inept, wearing a horrible brown suit with brown shirt and white socks, having his lunch fall over his lap as he sits outside, spilling his drink, and generally making an entire mess. And this is the setup for Will Smith to come in to do a character transformation on him. And again, we see in here how difficult it is to change the stereotype. The next slide, slide 13, has an ad from H&R Block. And this is interesting with the stereotype because H&R Block, while they're tax agents, they are not accountants. And they're not allowed to say they're accountants because that would be false and misleading advertising, breach of the Trade Practices Act. So to try and sell the image that they are accountants without actually saying it and getting in trouble with the law, they feed into the stereotype and show these group of dull people fascinated by numerical trivia to make the connection of people's heads between these people and accountants, even though they're getting away without saying those magic words, which they're not allowed to because of the Trade Practices Act. And what this is bringing us to, having looked at these stereotypes, and particularly looking at the way the stereotype is portrayed through humour, because one of the really great tools for understanding stereotypes is to look at humour, because humour tends to exaggerate things, and if we've got a bit of a stereotype, you can see it, you can strengthen and imagine. If you go hunting for accounting jokes on WordPress, you'll find a website of mine where I've got over 100 jokes about accountants. And again, you can see the stereotypes there. I'll actually put a link to it up on Moodle as well. So what we see with the stereotype is this dull, boring, sexless accountant, a pedant, overly interested in numbers, who couldn't possibly arrange a date if they tried. And we're going to look at, well, how does this help or hinder us as accountants in our work? Well, if we're going to be in a position of having to convince the public we're trustworthy, such as the role we fulfill when we're doing audits or preparing financial reports, this stereotype helps us because it makes us, while we're boring and dull and sexless, it makes us trustworthy. However, if we're fulfilling other roles in accounting, such as in system design or management consulting, the stereotype works against us because we're not imagined as people who have an imagination who can contribute new ideas. We're just the person who's going to get in there and say no. So the stereotype can both help and hinder us, and it's pointless to us trying to fight against it. It won't be successful. So we want to try and live with it. Now, despite that, I deliberately fight against it, in that when I present myself in lectures, I don't want to be perceived as an accountant. I want to be perceived as a teacher. When I present myself as research conferences, I want to be perceived as a researcher, not as an accountant. And for this reason, I don't wear a business suit. However, if I was to go and do work as an accountant, then yes, I would put on my business suit and portray the stereotype. But I try and do things to break the stereotype when I wanted to do it, such as now, when I want to be perceived as a teacher. So what I hope you've got out of this is, one, an understanding of what our stereotype is, and how it relates to the practice of accounting in both helping it and hindering it, and how we've got to live with it. We can't easily change it. This brings this section to a close. I'll be moving on to looking at artistic metaphors in the next file.